evening. I'm Lynn Pascarella. I'm the president of the Association of American Colleges and Universities. And I want to begin by thanking our sponsors for this evening's lecture and for tonight's welcome reception, Infrastructure Canvas. It's such an honor and privilege to welcome each and every one of you here this evening to the Geary Schneider Lecture on Liberal Education and Inclusive Excellence. Established in 2016 to honor Carol's visionary and transformative leadership of AAC&U as its president from 1998 to 2016, and delivered biennially at the association's annual meeting, the lecture promotes contemporary understandings of liberal education that are grounded in AAC&U's mission and values to advance the vitality and public standing of liberal education by making equity and quality the foundations for excellence in undergraduate education in service to democracy. We're thrilled to have Sean Harper, the Clifford and Betty Allen Chair in Urban Leadership, Provost Professor, Rossier School of Education at the Marshall School of Business, and founder and executive director of USC Race and Equity Center at the University of Southern California, with us to celebrate Carol's remarkable leadership and legacy. From colleges and universities and K through 12 to corporations, law firms, and Hollywood production companies, Dr. Harper provides a lens for understanding the most complex ethical, legal, and social issues of the day. An expert on racial, gender, LGBTQ issues, and college sports. He offers a clear and compelling voice for how higher education can lead the way in promoting racial and social justice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sean Harper.
Good evening. Thank you for showing up at 7 p.m. This is really terrific. It means a lot to me that you are here and that we are here together. Let me start by acknowledging Carol. She and I had a lovely series of email exchanges a couple weeks ago. She was writing to express her regrets for having another commitment and being unable to be here tonight, but it really does mean a lot to me to have been invited to give the Carol Geary Schneider lecture on inclusive excellence. I got a chance to know Carol really well during my tenure on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. We were just a train ride apart at that point, and I got a chance to work with her on a special issue of liberal education and some other projects here in AAC&U. So it really means the world to me, in fact, to have been invited by my friends, Tia McNair-Brown and Dawn Whitehead, whom I went to graduate school with, and certainly by Lynn. This is great. So why don't we get started? I want to highlight a portion of the theme for this year's AAC&U annual meeting. It's the second half of it that I found particularly striking. The association extended to you an invitation to lead. That is the part of the theme that I want to pick up on and talk about in a very particular way. I want to extend to you an invitation to lead specifically on racial equity. Now, it may feel like I am inviting you to a party that has already started, as a matter of fact. If you have not noticed, equity is very much on trend these days. We hear about it here, there, and everywhere. But what I find particularly alarming about the trendiness of equity is in precision, its popularity, without people operationalizing, a very clear definition of what it means, what it takes to advance it, and so on. So let me say to you that I am going to invite you to something with some conditions, as a matter of fact. I would like everyone here in this room and on the campuses that you represent to lead on racial equity. But I want to be very clear about the conditions that leadership on this particular brand of equity, racial equity, what it requires, what it demands. I will do a thing throughout this lecture that you may find strange. Let me say what it is now. I realize that there's only one of me here at the podium speaking to you. But throughout the night, I will often say we, us, and our. When I do that, I really am referring to the brilliant, very smart, very dedicated, very equity-minded, and beautifully diverse cadre of colleagues with whom I have the pleasure of doing my work at the USC Race and Equity Center. I did bring along some ideas that are uniquely mine to this podium tonight, but a lot of the work that I will talk about represents the collective effort of my colleagues at the center. So this would be the we, us, and our in the moments when I say we, us, and our. I would also be remiss if I didn't take just a moment, just a quick moment, to acknowledge my favorite university president in the country, the president of Governor State University, Elaine Maimon. And thank you, Elaine. And my dear friend Estella Mara Ben Simone from the University of Southern California. You will hear me mention Estella's pioneering work really at multiple junctures throughout the lecture. So let me get started on what I believe it takes to lead on racial equity. If you are going to accept this invitation of mine, there are some things I think you should know. Some of those things are informed by research that I've had the privilege of doing now for the past 16 years, really over almost the entirety of my faculty career. We've been doing at the center these qualitative campus racial climate studies for 16 years now. It started with just me as a lone individual early career professor, but when I founded the center 9 years ago at the University of Pennsylvania, it became an activity of the center and continues to be a signature activity of the work that we do at the USC Race and Equity Center. We have done these qualitative climate studies at more than 50. In fact, the number now is 59 colleges and universities all across the United States. We often say of our qualitative climate assessments that they've literally taken us from Princeton University to Portland Community College and a few dozen places in between in terms of size, type, geographic location, so on and so forth. In our qualitative climate assessments over the years, we have now conducted in-person interviews with more than 10,000 college students. Our climate assessments always include students of color as well as white students, because white students too are in fact a part of the campus racial climate. I will say here that throughout the night I'm going to talk mostly about students, but I will say that there has been on more than a handful of occasions now where college presidents, provosts, and deans have actually called us to assess qualitatively the climate, the racial climate for faculty and staff. Only on one foolish occasion did we attempt to do all three, students, faculty, and staff, in one visit. But really, the majority of the qualitative assessments that we've done at this point have been with students, more than 10,000 of them. That work usually entails going and spending 3 to 4 days on a campus doing seemingly nonstop monoracial focus group interviews. What I mean by monoracial is that we have several focus group interviews just with Pacific Islander and Asian American students. Another set just with Native American students. Another set with African American students, multiracial students, white students, and so on. As you might imagine, with 16 years of intense qualitative data collection, I really could spend the rest of the night and really the rest of this AACNU annual meeting telling you about the things that we found on all of these campuses over the years. In the interest of time, I won't do that. Instead, I will talk with you about what I believe are 5 key findings, some common occurrences that we see place after place, year after year, in region after region across the country. The first is that we've only been to one place to conduct a qualitative campus racial climate study where there had not been at least one black student who had been called the N-word by a white person. In some instances, that white person was a faculty member or staff member of the institution. It had become so commonplace, as a matter of fact. Let me be clear that I am not normalizing this particular act of racial violence, but I will say that after, I don't know, like maybe the 12th one of these campuses where we had done a campus racial climate and we had heard this so regularly that we had come to really expect it. We had come to anticipate that we are going to hear one or more African American students say to us in one of the black or more of the black student focus groups that they have been called the N-word on campus. Second is what we call curricular erasure. At every single place where we've done one of these climate studies, we have heard from students of color, not just black students, but also Latinx students, indigenous students, Asian American and Pacific Islander students, that they don't see themselves represented in the curriculum. This also tends to be a place where there's actually much agreement between students of color and their white peers. We hear from white students who have participated in our climate studies over the years that they don't learn much about people of color either in the curriculum. Very little is assigned to them, in fact, in classes to read about populations that are different from their own. But, you know, the invisibility of indigenous epistemologies, the invisibility of black women's cultural narratives and cultural histories, the absence of deep understandings of Latino persons and cultures in the curriculum really undermines sense of belonging. It undermines an institution's efforts and espoused commitments to create an inclusive campus environment. You know, one of the things that I want to acknowledge here about this lecture is that it is the Carol Geary Schneider Lecture on Inclusive Excellence. I really appreciate that AAC&U gave us language, that yours cannot be an excellent college or university if it is not inclusive. I'm going to tell you now that we hear quite consistently that the least inclusive place on every campus is the classroom. Again, because the diversity of the student body is not reflected in the content of the curriculum. Another common occurrence is what we call racial segregation, or what students talk with us about is racial segregation and ethnic clustering. You know, there has been such tremendous effort over the years to diversify the student body through admissions practices and through various enrollment management techniques. There are campuses like the one where Professor Ben-Simone and I work, where there are really lots of students of color, lots of people from different cultural and racial and ethnic backgrounds. I think that that has been, a tremendous project for American higher education to diversify the student body. But what a shame. What a shame that we spent all this money, we've invested all of this time to recruit a diverse student body, and we do nothing educationally, or we do very little, far too little educationally to make good educational use of the diversity in the student body. Students of color and their white peers alike tell us that there's very little substantive cultural and racial interaction on the campus. And when there is such interaction, that it is perhaps accidental or it is student-driven. It is very clear to them, as a matter of fact, that there is not an educational strategy, there's not an educational plan, there's several missed opportunities in classrooms and elsewhere to really leverage the diversity that we have recruited. The fourth is what I call racial illiteracy. It's here that I'm going to talk specifically about white students. You know, a lot of times when we're talking about inclusive excellence, we're talking about diversity and inclusion, and we're talking about equity, The conversation defaults to minoritized students, understandably, because that's where the data tell us that the inequities are. But I do want to talk for a moment here about what white students tell us. White students in our qualitative climate studies over the years, let's say those who are seniors, for example, tell us that they know not much more as graduating college seniors than they did 4 years prior when they were graduating seniors from high school. They tell us, as a matter of fact, as it pertains to race and racism and racial inequities, as it pertains to people of color and marginalized and minoritized communities, that they feel woefully underprepared, as a matter of fact, for citizenship, work, and leadership in a racially diverse democracy after college. They tell us that, unless one slips and falls into a sociology of race course or into an ethnic studies major, that one really literally could go through 4 years of undergraduate study without having a meaningful conversation or a meaningful set of learning opportunities around race. They feel illiterate, as a matter of fact. On a related note, I mentioned to you that when we do these qualitative climate assessments, that we do them in monoracial focus groups. Sometimes we do focus groups specifically with white student leaders. Not all the white students who participate are, leaders of clubs and organizations, but sometimes we deliberately curate focus groups with white student leaders. Across all of the groups, we ask students which groups of students are likeliest to feel the strongest sense of affirmation, belongingness, and inclusion here at the college or university. That particular question stumps white students. They say to us, particularly white student leaders, wait, don't everyone love it? Doesn't everyone love it here? This is such a great campus. It's such a great university. Everybody loves it here. Meanwhile, on the other side of the wall, colleagues of ours are facilitating a focus group with Latinx students who are in tears because of the racism and racial violence that they've experienced and continue to experience day after day on the campus. The point here is that on campus after campus, there's consistently white student overestimation of the realities, the belongingness, and the sense of inclusion among their students of color peers. I think the implication there, if we're thinking about a democracy, one unfortunate reality of our democracy is that white people occupy the most significant positions of leadership and authority in every sector of the American economy. Even as the nation becomes more brown, more diverse, as we look at those who are in the most significant leadership positions, including college and university presidents, 87% of whom are white. White people occupy the most significant positions of leadership and authority. In our Congress, our governors, CEOs, and so on. Almost all those people, not always, there's some one-offs, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, but in the overwhelming majority of those cases, those persons who occupy those leadership roles are college graduates, sometimes multiple times over, right? It has me wondering, as I think about our democracy, are we responsible when white students graduate from our colleges and universities with insufficient understandings of the ways in which racism is reproduced in policy, reproduced in management of organizations, reproduced in the ways in which workplace environments are established and maintained and so on. Are we responsible, as a matter of fact, for the cyclical reproduction of racism in America when we send college-educated white people, millions of them, into the world every year thinking that everything is just fine with people of color? When we've denied them curricular opportunities to understand structural racism and injustice in myriad forms. So these are just some of the, perhaps trillions of findings in the interest of time that I just chose to talk with us about tonight, given the spirit of this lecture. I will tell you, given the work that we have done over the years with these climate studies, as you might imagine, from 2015 onward, there's been significant demand for us to come to a place to do one of these climate assessments. There was a moment, as a matter of fact, in fall 2015, when there was a wave of student protests at Claremont McKenna, Yale, University of Missouri, and several dozen other colleges and universities across the country. There was a week in November, as a matter of fact, when the phones were ringing off the hook at the Penn, the then Penn Race and Equity Center. It was very distressed college presidents and provosts calling, asking, how fast can you get here to do one of your campus racial climate studies? We're suddenly interested in knowing the truth about how our students of color are experiencing the campus climate here, because we are afraid that they are being inspired by the activism that they're seeing elsewhere on campuses across the country. How fast can you get here? That demand has continued. I need not tell you that our current political climate has had a serious spillover to the climate on our college and university campuses. So much so that we, in fact, have exceeded our capacity at the USC Race and Equity Center to go and spend 3 to 4 days on a campus doing nonstop focus groups with students about the campus climate. So what we've done instead is taken that now 16 years of really rich, deep, qualitative insight and used it to construct a tool that is now enabling us to be more helpful to more colleges and universities as they attempt to understand the truth and the realities of the campus climate. Just use your imagination. There are like actual words coming through the video here. Once we start hearing those words, I'll like roll it back and we'll start again. I'm so confident that this is going to work just like it did in our rehearsal sound check like an hour ago.
Racial climates.
All right, so let's try again. All right, here we are.
The National Assessment of Collegiate Campus Climates, also known as the NAC, is a quantitative survey that will be administered annually at hundreds of participating colleges and universities across the United States. Through the NAC, thousands, perhaps millions, of college students will offer useful insights into the realities and complexities of race in higher education. NAC respondents will help us understand how various populations differently experience the colleges and universities they attend, where and what they learn about race, their feelings of preparedness for citizenship in a racially diverse democracy after college, and how racial issues in our broader society affect interactions and experiences on campuses. The USC Race and Equity Center will help institutional leaders use NAC survey results to improve racial climates, college experiences, and student outcomes.
Definitely, there are a lot of microaggressions that students of color go through every day. There have also been serious incidences where swastikas were drawn on doors and messages like "Make America Great Again" and Hitler graffiti was present through our campus. While these issues do exist, I strongly believe that With the constant support of university administration and students together can fix these in the long term.
So again, we took those 16 years of qualitative insights and used them to construct this national quantitative campus racial climate survey. We launched the NAC last February, and so far, 412,793 students on campuses across the country have received the NAC and participated in the survey. This has been our way of attempting, again, to be as useful as possible to college and university leaders as they attempt to better understand the realities and complexities of race on their campuses. Let me say, though, that a thing that I've learned now in 16 years of doing climate work, that it's not just about doing the qualitative assessment. It's not just about participating in the NAC, which, by the way, is a population survey. It goes to every full-time enrolled and part-time enrolled student at a campus. It's not just about doing it. You got to do something with the results, right? So let me talk about here some typical approaches to racial equity work. If you are going to accept my invitation to lead on racial equity, there are some things that others who have jumped on the equity bandwagon are doing that you probably don't want to do. It would not be very leader-like of you to reproduce these same trends. The first is that well-intended equity actors on campus attempt to do work on equity without any data on the campus racial climate. I am going to argue to you that it cannot be just looking at data that have been disaggregated from your Office of Institutional Research that show you where the gaps are between students of color and white students, or between particular minoritized groups and their peers. It can't just be that, right? When we approach equity work with only those data, I'm afraid that we arrive at incomplete understandings. We convince ourselves that, oh, black students are dropping out in much higher numbers because the high schools they attended underprepared them for the rigors of college level work. Or, oh, they are dropping out because disproportionately they come from lower income families and they can't afford any longer to be in college, or they have to work to finance their way through college. That's why they're dropping out. Or that, oh, it's because, I don't know, like maybe they aren't engaged in high impact practices, and that, you know, their disengagement is a predictor of who's likely to stay, who's likely to leave, and because black students are comparatively less engaged in, you know, particular experiences, that's why they're dropping out in such high numbers. Let me honor my colleagues who have done extraordinary work on student outcomes and student success for 6 decades. I am not suggesting that those factors are erroneous or that they are built on and derived from bad data. What I am suggesting, though, is that they're incomplete. Until and unless we know the experiential realities that undermine student success, increasing Pell Grant dollars on its own isn't going to close the gap, right? Giving more financial aid won't close the gap. So yeah, a lot of people come to the table attempting to solve the problem of racial inequities with no data about, again, the experiential realities of students of color and white students on their campuses. There also is this really interesting lack of discussion of race in equity team meetings. So one thing that is trending now is to have an equity task force or equity committee or some sort of equity team on a campus that works for a year or more to usually produce a plan And they come to the table, they have all sorts of data that have nothing to do with campus racial climate. Usually someone from the Office of Institutional Research joins the team, makes the data available. The data are disaggregated in all sorts of ways and so on. And we watch, and I know that this is a thing that Professor Ben-Simone and her team at the USC Center for Urban Education also do. We watch in an ethnographic way these equity team meetings. We don't disrupt the meetings. We're just in the room, sort of kind of like in the corner, just taking field notes and observing what happens in these 2-hour-long equity team meetings that happen once a month for an entire school year. Very smart people are on these equity task forces. Sometimes some of the smartest people at a college or university. It might shock you that a team of 12 really smart people will spend 2 hours a month for 9 months in meetings talking about equity and equity gaps and closing equity gaps, looking at data and so on, and there's not a single mention of race or racism or racist institutional policies, cultures, practices, mindsets, and so on, that might be reproducing and sustaining the very inequities that lay in front of us on the data reports that are at the heart of those meetings. So therefore, it shouldn't surprise you that one other typical approach to racial equity work is that those very smart people at the end of the year will produce a really comprehensive report that is, I don't know, like 60 pages. And it says not a word about race. There is a thing that I know that both Estella and I do. In fact, it was Estella who started doing this, and I thought that it was like quite novel, so I started doing it myself, where we take these PDFs of equity plans that have been produced by institutions, state agencies, foundations, and so on. And this is not going to sound very sophisticated, I know. It's Estella's method. I just followed along. We go to the upper right-hand corner of the PDF, and we type in words like race, racial, racist, racial equity, African American, Black, Latinx, Chicano, Hispanic, Latino, Native American, Pacific Islander, Asian American, so on and so forth. Now listen, we do more with these plans than simply go word fishing. What I am saying to you, though, is that a surprisingly high number of those plans, I mean, Estella, stop me if this is an exaggeration, damn near all of them don't include those words, don't include those terms. But it's an equity plan. Now, to be fair, the names of the racial and ethnic groups do appear often in data tables, in the data tables that are showing us quantitatively where the gaps are, where we're underserving students, and so on. But even there's this like really stupid thing that happens where the data will very clearly show us that it is Latinas that are being most chronically underserved on this particular metric. Then in the recommendations, there is a whole recommendation about how to improve student success on this particular metric, but it says not a word about Latinas. Yeah, that's the thing. If you want to lead on racial equity, yeah, you don't want to have a whole like 60-page or even 10-page or 2-page plan that says not a thing about race. It's paradoxical, as a matter of fact. We're going nowhere fast on meeting institutional equity goals if we cannot specify in our plans who it is we're talking about, who it is that's most underserved by us, who it is that is in most need of institutional support and attention. All right, 2 more here. Yeah, so about this 4th one, sometimes a well-intended provost will sit a black woman next to her oppressor in an equity task force meeting and expect them to do racial equity, as a matter of fact, on behalf of the university. What I'm saying here is that I know that I've spoken so far a lot about our student-focused climate assessments, but we hear so routinely from faculty and staff of color, most especially from women of color, about the chronic disrespect that they experience day after day on predominantly white campuses all across the country. But yet, they are expected to have a seat at the equity table with the very people who day after day after day contradict themselves on equity. The very people whose implicit biases and other explicit biases, in some instances, make them sort of a laughable, like unbelievable, like, no, like you can't mean that this person is at the table to do equity. And there's tension there. There's unacknowledged, unresolved racial tension. What I'm saying to you is that you can't move the needle through an equity task force or some other group where there's unacknowledged, unworked through racial tension. The last one here is that there is no remediation of racial illiteracy among faculty and staff. There's the R word that we don't like, remediation. I mean, racism is another one, but here we also don't tend to really like remediation. You know, so remediation, as I'm sure everybody here in the room knows, it's all about, you know, say in its classic form, students. Like, oh, students didn't get something in a prior educational context that they really should have gotten and that they're gonna need to have to thrive and succeed in this institutional context. Might it be that people who work at colleges and universities did not get in a prior educational context a deep course of study on race? They didn't learn how to actually advance and achieve racial equity on their campuses. They didn't really learn in graduate school or anywhere else how to make good use of racial tension when it arises in the classroom for, you know, the strategic manufacturing of an extraordinary educational moment. Might it then be that more is required through professional associations, through curriculum and professional learning opportunities for faculty and staff members at colleges and universities to upskill and equip people who are professionals with things that they never got anywhere else in their educational and professional upbringing? We cannot, and I feel very sure about this, we cannot lead on racial equity until we are taught how to lead on racial equity, until we are taught how to actually close racial gaps in student outcomes, until we are actually exposed to a course of study on how to better and more deeply understand the campus racial climate and how to correct it. You know, we have created at the USC Race and Equity Center an 8-week professional learning and organizational change series that we call the USC Equity Institute. It is for 20 leaders on a single college and university campus. Normally, a president or provost or dean calls us up and says, we want to do one of your equity institutes. We give that person a menu of 35 professional learning modules, and we say to them, pick 8 that seem best fit for the needs of your particular campus context. We then say to them, pick 20 people to go through the 8-week experience. Over those 8 weeks, we're going to gather that group of 20 people virtually, synchronously, all at the same time, for 90 minutes a week over 8 weeks, and we're literally going to teach people things that they never learned about race and about racial equity. Nope, they're not going to know everything after 8 weeks, but we can guarantee you that they're going to know a whole lot more after 8 weeks than they did prior to embarking on this professional learning journey. There are at least 3 things that we have learned so far from the USC Equity Institutes. We've now done them at dozens of campuses across the country. At least 3 things that we've learned. 1, most leaders never learn much about race or how to do racial equity. There's a thing that happens normally in the 3rd module. It doesn't matter what the 3rd module is, as a matter of fact. There are these confessions that are often made by the leaders who are engaged in the experience that, yeah, I'm the president of this college, and honestly, it has become really clear to me over the past 2 weeks that I don't know what I'm doing. I never learned these things. There's something, in fact, quite liberating about that, because then it gives other people the license to be like, whew, me either, so I don't have to fake it anymore. My president has said that he, or they don't know how to do this. I don't either. This is great that we're all a part of this experience and on this learning journey together, so that we could be more honest with each other about what is needed, not just on the executive team or in this group of 20, but really across our campus to upskill and deepen the learning of the people who work here. Second thing that we've learned is that colleagues don't know how to talk to each other and with each other about race and racism at their institutions. This actually builds on a finding from our qualitative campus climate studies over the years. So it didn't surprise us when we started seeing this in the Equity Institutes. There is a code of silence around race in the higher education workplace. It's taboo. It's not a thing that we talk about. We walk on eggshells. We talk around it. We don't talk specifically about it in faculty meetings with colleagues, in executive team meetings, and in other spaces. Why? Because people are oftentimes scared to death, right, of making a mistake. See, in our qualitative climate assessments with faculty and staff members, white faculty, staff members, and administrators have said to us, I don't touch it, I don't talk about race because I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to come across as naive. I mean, I am supposed to be the associate provost, so I'm supposed to know things. So I don't want to come across as naive. And I for sure don't want to come across as racist. White people are scared to death of coming across as racist. So therefore, I'm not gonna touch it. People of color often tell us that, I'm not gonna touch it because I feel unsafe in doing so. You know, the black dude who was here before me, who'd be the person to raise these issues, he was caricatured as the angry black man. And it was really painful for me to see him being further and further marginalized and pushed out of his position, pushed out of the institution. So no, I'm good. I'm definitely not gonna put my professional future at risk on behalf of trying to make this institution a better place. Nah. Other times, there are people of color who tell us, quite plainly that racial battle fatigue has ensued for them. The literal exhaustion, being exhausted of being the one Latina who in meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting has to fight her white colleagues to get them to care more about Latinx students. It wears her out. She gets exhausted. So she's like, you know what? As an act of self-protection, emotional and psychological, and in some cases physiological self-protection, I'm not going to engage in more conversations about race at this institution. I'm done. We know for sure at the USC Race and Equity Center that you cannot lead on racial equity. So give the invitation back. If somebody else has invited you to the party that I'm inviting you to, if somebody else came across in a bandwagon and you jumped on it and you're like, yeah, I'm doing equity, but you cannot have an open and honest conversation about race with your colleagues, you need to give the invitation back, because you cannot move the needle on racial equity if you can't talk about race. It has become really clear to us. It is impossible. Despite your best efforts, despite whatever is in your heart and soul, you cannot, with integrity and with honesty, do racial equity if you can't talk about race. That's another thing that we've learned in these institutes, that we are now finally setting a table and creating the conditions that allow colleagues, sometimes for the very first time in their entire lives. We have people in their 60s participating in these institutes who will say to us, usually, I don't know, like maybe around the 5th module, that like, yeah, I'm 63, I've never talked about this. Okay, the last one is that leaders actually can be taught how to lead on racial equity. That's the good news here. And this is helping us to turn the corner here towards some actionable steps that people might take. It has been delightful for me. In fact, I am going to declare it here. It has been the most satisfying moment in my career to actually see leaders learn how to do something that is so important to me, that is so important to those more than 10,000 students whom we've interviewed, the more than 400,000 students whom we've surveyed. It's so delightful and satisfying to me to finally see leaders and educators learn how to do the things that are required to do right by those students. It's delightful. So yeah, no, people actually can learn, and we have some diagnostics and everything where we learn, we measure what people learn pre and post and so on, and we continue to follow their journeys beyond the 8 weeks through a series of strategic racial equity projects that they do with us, with ongoing coaching and support for 18 months. It is delightful to see that people finally learn, after 63 years, how to do something. All right, so let's talk about what equity requires in our final moments here together. There are at least 11 things. Nope, they're not the only 11 things. There are more. But I can guarantee you that if we make a commitment to doing these 11 things, that they'll move us so much farther along in actualizing the commitments that we espouse to diversity, equity, inclusion, and inclusive excellence on our campuses. If we do these 11 things, they will make a difference. If you are going to accept the invitation to lead on racial equity, you got to do these 11 things. The first is you have to courageously denounce white supremacy. In all its forms. I don't mean only in the 2017 tiki torch carrying white nationalist version of white supremacy that we saw on display in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia. I don't just mean that. As a matter of fact, I'm going to say to you quickly what I said to the employees of the University of Virginia 6 days after those white nationalists came and poisoned their communities. I stood on a stage in an auditorium with hundreds of UVA employees, and I said to them, you cannot be just horrified and disgusted by the particular manifestation that you saw on display here last Friday night. What about the white supremacy that's on display in your political science department? In the curriculum in your humanities? Yeah, you got to denounce that too. The curriculum is a site of white supremacy. Students of color tell us on campus after campus after campus. And that appraisal is corroborated by what white students tell us they don't learn about people of color. That has to be denounced. It has to be a thing that a dean or a department chair or a provost or a president says, enough with the whiteness of the curriculum. We must have a curriculum that reflects 21st century students. We must have a curriculum that reflects a 21st century America. Otherwise, we are failing our democracy. Yeah, it requires that. You got to say that confidently. You got to mean it. I don't think there's anything to lose, by the way, in doing so. I think your students of color would be so proud of you. So too would your faculty and staff colleagues of color. Equity also requires talking about race and racism among colleagues. Again, it's just an underscoring of an earlier point that you can't do racial equity. You can't achieve it, accomplish it, very seriously move it forward, celebrate it, market it, talk about it like with integrity if you can't talk about race and racism. It has to be an ordinary activity of your department, of your unit, of your leadership team. If you don't know how to do it, get a facilitator to help break the ice. It's one of those things that I feel so proud about with those Equity Institutes, that over those 8 weeks we break the ice and allow people to continue to have first-time conversations that then become sustainable. An invitation to equity requires that. It also requires strengthening one's racial literacy. Racial literacy requires actual literacy. It requires reading things. It surprises me that I've now consulted with hundreds of colleges and universities across the country, and there are leadership teams and whole faculties and other people who are struggling to figure out what to do around diversity and inclusion on their campus. And I'm like, wait, have you read one of Estella Ben-Simon's 45 books? And they're like, no, we heard of her, but no, we hadn't read one of her 45 books. She has a new one, by the way, with Tia Brown McNair and Lindsay Malcolm Pugh that is here at the conference, yes. You should get that one. It's amazing. It's really good. There are so many answers in that book. So I asked them, well, what about Daryl G. Smith's books about making faculty diversity work, or Caroline Turner's work on diversifying the faculty and improving the experiences of faculty of color, or Sam Macias's work on Asian American students in higher education, or Julie Park's work on how to talk about race and how to, understand the complicated nature of race on campuses. What I'm saying to you here is that on campus after campus after campus, people look at me like, what are you talking about? That we didn't even know that there was a whole literature around these things. There is this paradoxical way in which people go about attempting to solve a problem without reading the instructions. To be sure, it can't be about reading just one of those books and declaring oneself woke or declaring oneself suddenly racially literate. It requires ongoing professional learning, deep learning, and skill building. The kinds of things that we expect of our students, we have to expect of people who work on college and university campuses, right? It has to be about becoming more highly skilled. That ought to be an expectation that those of us who are leading on racial equity, the people that we are leading, we have to convey to them that we expect of them that they become more highly skilled. Notice that I didn't say that we expect them to become culturally competent. Oh, I hate it. I hate cultural competence, like a lot. Let me tell you why I hate it. And I'll tell you very quickly here in the form of just a 30-second story. When I moved from Philadelphia to Los Angeles 2.5 years ago, one of the first things I did, because I love myself, is search for a physician. I wasn't looking for one who was merely competent. I don't know. Let's take a look at how this could play itself out. Oh no, the sound is gone again.
Guess who just got reinstated?
All right.
Have you ever worked with Dr. Francis?
Oh yeah, he's okay.
Just okay?
Guess who just got reinstated? Well, not officially. Nervous?
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. Don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. I'll see you in there.
Just okay is not okay.
As it pertains to inclusive excellence, I'm going to use your terminology. Just okay is not okay. As it pertains to equity in the curriculum and in the classroom, just okay is not okay. Having faculty and staff members who are merely competent is not okay. That is not going to be the radical transformation that many of our campuses demand and require and deserve as we attempt again to make good on the promises that we make in our mission statements, on our websites, in admissions brochures, and presidential speeches and elsewhere about a so-called commitment to diversity and inclusion. If all of the people around you are just okay, yeah, those things are not going to be actualized. Just a few more things that if you're going to accept my invitation, this is what it requires. It requires racializing the curriculum. It requires refusing to presume immunity and exemption. There's that survey that is published every year in Inside Higher Ed, the survey of college presidents. There's this hilarious but yet pathetic pair of questions in the survey about racial climate on campuses and race relations, I think is how they frame it. The first question asks college presidents, how would you characterize race relations on your campus? More than 80% of them say that, race relations here are good or excellent. The next question, how would you characterize race relations on campuses elsewhere across the country that are not your own? Ridiculously, more than 80% of them are like, oh, it's terrible in other places. You're absolutely delusional if you think that the things that are playing out in the news and diverse issues in higher ed and Inside Higher Ed and the Chronicle on CBS News and other places, if you think that your campus is somehow exempt from or automatically just magically immune to the things that are happening everywhere else racially, you are absolutely delusional. You probably should do the NAC to get a real sense with some real data to understand the realities and where the opportunities are. I probably don't think you want to wait until disaster strikes on your campus to finally understand that, oh wait, we had a real problem that was hiding in plain sight all along. All right, just two more. Certainly it's about understanding and correcting implicit bias. It can't be just about giving people skills and strategies. It also has to be about awakening the consciousness of faculty and staff members on our campuses about the biases and assumptions and mindsets that they bring to classrooms and other places. That has to be a necessary part of the professional learning. It has to also be about rejecting deficit notions about Black and Latinx students. I don't have time to talk with you about a study that we did across 40 traditional public high schools in New York City with college-bound, college-ready Black and Latino boys, and how those boys went on to college, and we learned, what it was that allowed them to successfully transition from high school to higher education. It's all in the report. If you simply do a Google search for Succeeding in the City, you'll find it. It's also publicly available on the USC Race and Equity Center website, or you can find it through this bit.ly. I've given you a multitude of options here to find this report. The thing about the report, though, that I think is really important, if we're going to have a successful racial equity strategy, shouldn't it include insights from students who've actually been successful? Might we learn something? And I'm not talking about an analysis of individual notions of exceptionalism and hard work and grit I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about understanding the institutional policies and structures and the behavioral norms of people who work at the institution, advising relationships, relationships with faculty members, the substance of those things. Wouldn't we want to know, like, what it was about all of that that allowed particular students to succeed? And then we should probably do more of that. We should scale it and replicate it. Weirdly, we attempt to do the work of racial equity by only focusing on what's not working, where the problems are, when success is hiding in plain sight for us. All right, I promise. These are the last three things here. Equity requires, again, acknowledging and addressing racial tension among colleagues. I talked about that earlier. You can't put these people at the table and expect magic to happen between them when there's all sorts of racial tension and racial history between them. Nope, it's not going to work. Equity requires taking strategic action to address racial inequities. Strategic action. It's not just about having an equity plan that reveals for us where the equity gaps are, and then there's some recommendations at the end. Recommendation and strategy are two different things. I go to far too many campuses that are spinning themselves in circles, trying to do something about the equity problem or the equity opportunity. And I ask, well, could you share with me your strategic plan? No, we don't have a strategic plan, Professor Harper. They often say to me, we got these recommendations from the task force, but we don't have a strategy. As Lynn mentioned, I live half of my faculty life in the Marshall School of Business at USC, and I teach strategy around equity, diversity, and inclusion there. This work requires the same sort of strategic planning and effort that your institution finance strategy requires. Nobody puts together just a mere set of recommendations for the financials of the institution. There's actual finance strategy. Yeah, this requires that. It's another thing that we do in those USC Equity Institutes. We take those 20 people and we put them on 4 project teams, each in a particular opportunity area. And over those 8 weeks, they develop strategic racial equity plans with lots of feedback and coaching from us. And at the end of the 8-week experience, those 4 projects take flight on each of the campuses with ongoing coaching and support from us for 18 months. I honestly think that it requires that level of detail and coaching and support and assessment and so on. The last thing here is that equity requires aligning demographics of the campus workforce with diversity of the student body. As our campuses have become more diverse in the student population, that diversity has not, the diversity of the faculty has not kept pace with the diversity of the student body. Here's what we're doing at the center about that particular challenge and opportunity.
We live in a time of tremendous change. By the year 2020,
the United States will be more racially and ethnically diverse than ever before.
Our local communities are being shaped by new voices and important conversations. They are moving us towards becoming more inclusive.
Our campuses are also changing in ways that challenge us to think and see our workforce differently.
We ask ourselves,
are we ready?
What if there was a way to easily identify and recruit highly skilled talent? Racially and ethnically diverse professionals poised for careers in higher education.
What if there was a platform that allowed us to create targeted job postings and establish professional relationships with prospective candidates?
And what if that still wasn't enough? What if there were also dynamic resources that could help our institutions better achieve professional equity?
What if there was one place to access it all?
Now there is. Welcome to PRISM.
Quickly, I'll just say to you that a year ago, in February 2019, we launched PRISM, which is a racial equity recruiting tech tool for colleges and universities. There are now thousands of people of color in PRISM with standardized profiles. They are people who work in higher education, either as administrators or as faculty members, or they are career switching professionals from other industries, say HR in a corporate context, who have some interest in working in HR on a college or university campus. Literally thousands of them now are in prison with searchable profiles that are searchable by keyword, by position, role type, so on and so forth. We have now taken away the excuse that we don't know where to find highly qualified people of color. There's a pipeline problem. Nobody's going to come to rural Iowa to work. Yeah, people in their prison profile can click and indicate where they're willing to work. A surprisingly high number of folks, by surprisingly high number, I mean it's hovering around 90%, say they're willing to work anywhere. Colleges and universities subscribe to PRISM to find people for faculty searches and for searches, staff and administrator positions. Equity doesn't require that you use PRISM, but it does require that you use some sort of tool, resource. It does require that you are much more deliberate and strategic in diversifying the higher education workforce and aligning the demographics of the workforce with the demographics of the student body. Okay, so I'm gonna close out here with the invitation. My dad has been a pastor in the AME church now for nearly 40 years. Sunday after Sunday, at the end of service, he stands before the congregation and he extends to them a three-pronged invitation. First is to confess that you're a sinner and to accept the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Clearly, I have no experience with leading this particular thing. Okay, it's that. Then, so people come up to the front and say, okay, yes, I want to confess that I'm a sinner. Then he says, okay, now some of you have already done that exercise before, but you may have sort of backslid. You may have fallen out of God's good graces, and you want to, come back into God's good graces. You come up here too, all right? Then some people come up. Then he says, okay, the third part of the invitation, the church, is welcome to all. We want to invite people. If you don't have a church home, we'd love for you to be our church home. Come up here if you're interested in joining the church. Okay, look, I'm not going to turn this into a religious ceremony in case you're getting nervous about that. What I am going to say, though, is in the spirit of my favorite pastor. I do want you to confess, as a matter of fact, that there is more work to be done on myself, on my colleagues, on our faculty, on our administrative team. I'm going to confess that we don't know how to achieve and advance racial equity. I'm going to confess that all of that stuff that we put in that last diversity brochure, it sounded really good. But confession, we don't know how to do it. I'm going to confess that our curriculum is too white. I'm going to confess that our faculty is too white. I am going to confess that when I checked that survey option in the Inside Higher Ed survey of college presidents, where I said the race relations here were good or excellent, I'm going to confess that I actually didn't know for sure. I based that on nothing. I have no data to confirm that belief. I'm going to confess. I am inviting you to confess that you've talked about equity in the abstract, but you've done it in a terribly raceless way. Confession. There's some of you who already did that part. You've gotten to an institution and you're really frustrated because you have these values and these commitments, but it's not really the cultural norm and priority of the institution. So you kind of pulled back. Or that you actually know how to engage in a productive conversation about race, but you pulled back because you don't want to come across as the angry, bitter person of color, or as the white person who's going to make a mistake. You're a white person who cares so deeply about race and racial justice, but yet you're in this context, you're in this environment that has rendered you silent way too many times. When there was a white voice needed to speak courageously, truthfully, yours was the white voice that could have done that, but you chose not to. I'm inviting you to reclaim what it is that is really in the depths of your soul around racial equity, and to use your platform, your voice, your resources, your authority, your good reputation, and your whiteness for good. That's the invitation. And lastly, because I run a business, I am going to invite you to join the USC Race and Equity Center in taking full advantage of the tools and resources that we have created to help college and university leaders and faculty members make good on the promises that they make concerning equity. We didn't create this stuff just because we were bored and needed a hobby. We created it because there was an urgent need on campuses across the country. We invite you to join us in making good use, good strategic use of those equity institutes, of PRISM, of the National Assessment of Collegiate Campus Climate. Later this fall, when we release a new set of surveys on the campus climate for faculty and staff, we invite you to use those things. That is what leading on racial equity requires. It requires accepting some version of that invitation. Again, I thank you all so much for providing me this opportunity to address our colleagues. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Dawn, we still have time for some questions? All right, Dawn tells me that we have time for a few questions. Are there microphones? All right, there are 3 microphones somewhere. So actually, I see 2 of them, all 3 of them here in the center of the room. So thank you for that response. I really appreciate it. It's quite generous. Yes, if you have any questions or reactions, critiques, pushback, I welcome it all.
Professor Harper, I have to do this because you've created a safe space. And I will probably never in my career be able to do this again except for in this room. I'm a black woman. And that was the most uncomfortable experience I have ever had.
Thank you.
And I thank you for giving it to me.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. Were I my father, I would say, let the church say amen. Any other questions or declarations of discomfort?
Thank you. I wondered, how do you assess adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and trauma, and how do you fold it, if you do, into your assessments of campuses and in your Racial Justice Institute?
Sure, yeah, no, that's a really good question. The answer is we don't, to be honest with you. I mean, those are important things, for sure. It's just that we try to focus in a very disciplined way on institutional experiences. Now, I'm not saying that we ought to discard the histories that students bring with them and the trauma that perhaps students often bring with them. We're more concerned with the trauma that is reproduced in their chemistry classroom. The trauma that ensues when one is called the N-word by a white employee of the college. That's where we've chosen to focus our efforts. Again, not rendering the other kinds of adverse childhood experiences unimportant. I will tell you one thing that we do in the NAC, in the National Climate Assessment, is that we do try to get a sense of the racial climate and the racial environment from which students came, respondents came, and we ask them to juxtapose those experiences with the experiences that they're having in their college or university context. We added those questions because it became very clear to us that students of color were often caught by surprise. They would say to us all those years in the qualitative climate assessments, they were caught by surprise by the racism that awaited them at the colleges or universities in which they enrolled. And we would ask them, well, why were you so surprised? And they will say, well, I grew up in this one context that, was really inclusive, really affirming, and so on. And yet I got here and, it was like all this madness, people calling me the N-word and carrying on, and there are nooses everywhere. And so that's about as far as we go, and sort of, inviting students to juxtapose their sort of prior life experiences and context with their collegiate context. All right, I see two people here at the mic, so we'll take these two and we'll call it a good night.
So you did the call, and we can do the response of amen. But my amen is specifically in regards to the issues of the curriculum, making the curriculum more inclusive. I am a chemist, and I worry especially about how to make the curriculum more inclusive in the STEM classes. If you have suggestions of how to do that, places to look, always looking for good ideas.
I do have great examples of where to look. Estella, Tia, and Lindsay's book would be a great place to look. Lindsay Malcolm Picue has written quite eloquently and brilliantly about this in her work. She is at Caltech, as a matter of fact. She and others help us understand how math isn't just math. I get in arguments with mathematicians all the time who suggest to me that math is just math, and that all of this stuff that you're talking about concerning diversity and inclusion, it didn't have a thing to do with the teaching of math. In the interest of time, I'm just simply going to say that beyond Lindsay, there are so many people who have written about this. The answers are hiding in plain sight on the internet, and I don't mean like a Wikipedia page that lacks credibility. I mean serious scholars who've thought about this in a really practical way. Moves that one can make in a math classroom or in a chemistry classroom or anywhere else in the STEM fields. If I go down the rabbit hole of starting to name specific strategies and stuff, a thing is going to happen that always happens to me when I respond to this question. We're going to be here 20 minutes later because I'm going to be like, ooh, let me just give you one more. But then I got another one. But I'm just going to say to you that this is an example of one of those things that I talked about earlier that has been written about, that I'm afraid that faculties in STEM departments are not reading these very practical, very wise suggestions and strategies.
Thank you so much for this incredible presentation. And I have a lot of confessions I could make, but I'm not going to focus on those. I want to ask you, though, for those of us, and there are many of us here, I think, at this conference, who actually do bring up equity all the time to other leaders, especially those with more authority and power, and it goes nowhere. And we become the broken records, always raising equity. And I'm just wondering what advice you have for ways to be more strategic and more productive in really bringing equity into the foreground of of how we do business in our institutions.
Yeah, I bet my friend Greg Britton is particularly frustrated with me right now. He's sitting right across from you. He's my editor at Johns Hopkins University Press. I bet he's thinking, if I could just get my damn book finished, that the answers to this question are there. When Race Matters in College, published by Johns Hopkins University Press, eventually publishes, it should be required reading for your colleagues. But in the meantime, Estella has, 45 books. Here are some useful things, some practical things. I am a huge fan of having institutional leaders bring to their meetings, their cabinet meetings, their faculty meetings, if you're a department chair or whatever, an article from Diverse Issues in Higher Ed. My friend Jamal Watson is here, who works at Diverse, about a thing that happened at a place. I love Diverse Issues in Higher Ed, so this is definitely in no way a critique. But I don't know, Jamal, it takes me, no more than 6 minutes ever to read one of your articles. They're always really brilliant and perfectly written and everything. The point here, right, is that sometimes taking 6 minutes to have us all read about a thing that happened somewhere else, and then taking 6 more minutes to assess, could that kind of thing happen here? And people are going to say, no, that kind of thing would never happen here. I don't usually name names of institutions, but I'm going to this time. I was recently at the University of Kentucky. Somebody suggested to me that a thing that happened at University of Tennessee would never happen at University of Kentucky. Wait, how do you know? How can we be so sure? But the place is kind of a lot like ours. Regionally, historically, compositionally. We're in the same athletic conference. I understand that not every institution that's in an athletic conference is the same. But what I am suggesting, right, is that an article from Diverse or from Inside Higher Ed could be used to help ignite a conversation about what can we do in a preemptive, proactive fashion to ensure that this thing that happened at a place that's almost identical to ours never happens here. That's one thing. Second thing is, sorry if it sounds like I'm trying to sell you a climate survey. A college president said the same thing that you just said. She said that she felt like she was a broken record on her campus. It's a good thing she was the president. So, really no one could silence her, right? But the president decided that her college was going to do the NAC. Then she handed us off to, the people who actually, in institutional research, who, give us the data files with the student emails and all that stuff, right? The person in the Office of Institutional Research said, I don't know why we're doing this. We don't have a problem here. Our president is so convinced that we have a problem here. We were yeah, keep talking. We're going to tell her that you said this. But we're not disrespectful to our campus partners. But, we kind of playfully said to that person, well, that's great that you don't have a problem. That's going to be wonderful. When your survey results come back and they show us that you don't have a problem, that's going to be amazing. You could go back to your president and say, see, we don't have a problem. Guess what? They did the survey and there were all sorts of problems, a ton of them. So I'm going to say to you, right, that a data-based argument could bolster your case. There are already data that exists that could show, perhaps like some racial and ethnic differences, among particular student outcomes or employment outcomes or whatever. I would argue pairing those with data about the realities of the campus racial climate could help people understand it. Actually, we ought to be thankful to you for keeping this on our radar, because we do have some serious challenges and opportunities here. The last thing that I will say, as a matter of sort of advice, right, for folks like, oh, here she goes again. Until and unless you are absolutely certain that there is no inequity at your institution, my advice to you is going to be to keep that broken record spinning, continue to be the squeaky wheel, continue to be the person who, with every fiber of your being, attempts to hold yourself and your colleagues accountable. Please don't give up. I know that sounds like kind of sort of like la la la. We need more people to do that. We need more people. We need more persistence. I sometimes play in my head with often used higher ed terms like remediation. I'm writing a piece now in a chapter in my book with Hopkins, where I'm writing about persistence. We need you to be more persistent, right? We need you to also find other people on your campus who share the same concern that you share, who share the same commitment that you share, and you start a group with them. And that group, over time, should become larger and more inclusive. And after a while, it's not just you anymore. It's probably not just you now, but you have then a chorus of people. It would do you good, as a matter of fact, to strategically put people who are politically powerful in this group, people who have access to the power epicenter of the institution, to join you in flexing your collective power to have a collective impact on raising institutional consciousness around these issues. That would be my recommendation. I'm also going to recommend at this time that we call for the benediction, and that I send you on to have a wonderful night and a fantastic conference. Again, thank you so much for having me.